Welcome to Marriage Matters. My name is Rabbi Schonbuch. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist based in Brooklyn and around the world via Skype. We're going to be concluding my series on my new book, Think Good, It Will Be Good, tonight. And I want to begin by talking about this idea that a person can imagine their future before it happens. It's a very powerful idea. Last week's lecture, we talked about forgiveness. And we were mitbonen, we were concentrating and meditating upon the concepts of forgiveness. We read from the book, the Tomer Devorah. And just the day after that, I forgave somebody for something that I maybe would not have easily done in the past, but because I was meditating on it with this group together, I was more ready for it. So some things which we do prepare us for the future. It does not mean there's always an automatic reaction. If people studied tzedakah every day, for example, now I'm studying this in the Rambam, one is more open to giving tzedakah when necessary, because you're thinking about these ideas. So tonight's topic is the last chapter, so to speak, of my book, Think It Will Be Good, about creating your future. So we've gone through the earlier steps of creating space and going above and thinking good. So once you've done that, you're in a different mode, psychologically and religiously. You're a person that has space between their thoughts, their feelings, and actions. They're able to slow down their thoughts. You're also able to go above a situation. So instead of looking things, as we say, within the box, you're able to look at things psychologically from outside of the box. And you're able now, with those thoughts that are slower, and you're thinking more broadly, then to think positive thoughts. So you've just transformed yourself from a state of depression, anxiety, perhaps, or some other pain you're going through, to a more positive state of mind. This is incredibly important. I have a client today I was talking to, and I said to him, you need to make a choice between turning the switch on or off. It's plus or minus. And people can, even if they're suffering from depression, anxiety, still, despite their thoughts and feelings, despite everything, they can also introduce positive thoughts in their mind. So it's incredibly powerful to be able to turn that switch on. Where are my thoughts now? Are they negative or positive? If they're negative, switch to the positive. Once you're doing that, the final step is creating your future, creating something for yourself. And as I just mentioned before, the more you meditate in what can be, it helps you to become what you could be. This is an incredible lesson in life. To spend time imagining what life would be like without depression, without anxiety, without struggle, without pain. Even if you're feeling depression, you're feeling anxiety, and you are experiencing trauma, you introduce a new layer to your consciousness of imagining a different type of future. This is so incredibly important psychologically. You peek into the future with somebody that you're trying to help. And you know that a person who's in suffering emotionally, depression, anxiety, and so on, spending a lot of time in their past. There's a lot of disappointment. There's a lot of rumination about things that happened to them, happened to their parents, happened to them when they were children. Most of these things are clearly beyond their control. They had no control over them. They just happened to them. But at some point, even though that they're experiencing thoughts about their past, you also want to then introduce possibilities of their future. So you could say, well, I'm still depressed. I'm still feeling sad. I'm still scared. Yes, well, despite, the keyword in psychology, according to Viktor Frankl, what I believe in logotherapy is despite what you're experiencing, you have to squeeze out, you have to find a small space in your mind somewhere. And despite your feelings of depression, anxiety, you find a small space of thinking about life without depression, without anxiety, going beyond yourself. Because this is the one thing you are in control of. You're not in control of your past, because it's already happened. But you are in control of your future and your present. You can choose, and even if your present is difficult, you could say perhaps you're not in control of your present at times. There's one one tense you can control, you can create. With tremendous creativity, enthusiasm is your future, even though it hasn't happened yet. So let's tonight look at how to create a future for yourself, even if you're not there yet, and to think about it deeply. But I also like to begin as I do in the book, this chapter, with a mashal, a metaphor from Viktor Frankl. So in 1970, I believe, he was visiting the University of Toronto, speaking to a group of college students, a few thousand college students. And this video is available on YouTube. It's a great free way to watch Viktor Frankl. And he turned to the audience, and he was talking about the need when working with teenagers at risk. Teenagers, this is the 1970s, right? Teenagers who were in trouble, rebelling into drugs, into delinquency, to give them a sense of meaning in their lives. And to elevate what he says, in his words, is a spark within every human being for a positive future, for a sense of meaning in their lives. And he was in his 70s at the time, he had gray hair, and he turned to the audience and he said, "You're not going to believe this, but he in his old age took up flying lessons recently. And he learned something in flying lessons, that if you're going from point A to point B, in that direction, from A to B, and there's a crosswind blowing in that direction, if you aim towards B, and there's this crosswind, you're going to end up lower than you expected. You're going to go to let's call this C, right? So if you aim for B and there's a crosswind, it's going to push you down. But he learned in flight lessons, how do you get to B if there's a crosswind? You aim for a higher point, you aim for D. And he called this crabbing. I guess it moves like a crab, like this. And you move like this, so to speak, but you move north of your direction, so to speak, and you arrive at your direction. So this is the ab maxim. This is the great principle of all positive psychology, he believes, is that if you take a man for who he is, you make him worse. If you help somebody become who they should become, they can become who they can be. This is a very powerful saying.
Can you say that line?
Well, let me quote the saying as he quotes it more effectively, because I think he summarizes it. He says as follows: if we take man as he is, we make him worse. But if we take him, it's page 98, but if we take him as he should be, we make him be capable of becoming what he can be. Said it much better than I did. This is not even Viktor Frankl. This is the famous philosopher Goethe, who he was a very big fan of. Many of his writings come from Goethe and so on. But he believed that a person needs to reach for something higher than themselves to become who they can become. That's what I was talking about before. What is the future you like to create for yourself? You create your star. You create that vision of yourself. And once you have it, you propel yourself towards that vision of what you can become. And then perhaps you'll become who you can be. So this begs us to ask certain questions psychologically with clients and with ourselves. What would my life be like without depression or anxiety? What would I be doing? Wow. That is a difficult question, people that are suffering. But have them imagine for a few moments, well, what would I be doing differently? I'd be talking to people, I'd be traveling more, I'd be more productive financially perhaps. What changes will take place when my life is better? What would I be doing differently when all the problems have been resolved? What would I like to become in the future? It's becoming basically an architect of your future. And the wonderful thing is, if you focus on the future, you are indeed an architect of it. You cannot be an architect of your past, because you have to become an archaeologist of your past. The architecture is for the future, archaeology is clearly for the past. There were two psychologists who also believed this in the 1970s. And they created something called solution-focused therapy. Really remarkable change in the direction of psychology. It was created out of the movement of marriage and family therapy, the movement I was trained in. And solution-focused therapy believed that most of psychology was simply more focused on problems and on the past than on their future. So they wanted to change the very language of people's problems. They believed language had a very powerful impact in people's lives. As I mentioned a few times before, this very famous doctor, Bernie Siegel, When someone said to them they had machla and said it was a death sentence, he would say it's a challenge. The very nature of death versus challenge is very, very powerful in a human psyche. One instills hopelessness, one instills hope. So too, how we talk about something influences how it turns out. So if we spend time talking to people psychologically about their problems, then perhaps they can't get beyond their problems because they're just dealing with them. They said there's either problem talk or solution talk. So with clients, they would do a lot of solution talk and avoid the problem talk. So one of the things they did was called the exception question. The exception question asked people about times when they didn't experience their own symptoms. What were you doing differently at those times when you weren't feeling depressed? Even somebody who's depressed, it's unbelievable, or anxious, there are times when they're not depressed. Or let's say there are times when they're less depressed or they're less anxious. What are you doing when you're less depressed and less anxious? And just think about what people do. They're on the phone talking to somebody, perhaps. It gives them a certain sense of elevation, relief. They are taking a walk in the park. They are watching something enjoyable, perhaps. They are speaking to a friend. They are painting a picture. They are studying something new, something on the internet which brings them interest. They're creating something, perhaps. They're working, they're teaching. And the answer to the exception question is, well, if the answer to that question is you were talking to your friend and that made you feel a little bit less depressed, so why not consider doing more of that now? This is really incredible. So you can help people because they will have their own solution. You just have to ask them, well, what were you doing when you weren't depressed? And say, do more of that now. So you become the coach for, so to speak, fishing. You go on a fishing expedition, you gotta find the fish. The catch is, oh, this is what they told you that they're doing when they're feeling less depressed, less anxious, so you help them do more of that. That's called the exception question. There's also something called the miracle question, which is what I was talking about before. What would life be like without the history of your problem? What if you had a miracle tonight and you woke up and everything had changed? What would you be doing differently? How would life be different? How would you know things have changed? You're entering them into a world of new possibilities. You're going beyond their illness. You're going beyond their difficulty, beyond their problems. And you're talking about the future at that point. I have to tell you how powerful it is psychologically. People will sit for years in therapy and never be asked to imagine what life would be like without their illness. The more you talk about your positive future, eventually the more you become your future. As I said before, we were learning together last week about forgiving, and the next day I had an opportunity where I forgave somebody. It was so powerful emotionally to me because I was thinking about it. The more you think about a positive future, despite your symptoms, the more you'll be able to achieve it eventually in your own time. So it's so important to spend time in the future. The next part of solution-focused therapy is to help the client maintain an optimistic view between sessions, whether this is a friend of yours if you're not a therapist or somebody you're going to see once in a while. So you can ask me, this is a brilliant thing they do in solution-focused therapy. You say like this: between this session and the next session, please observe what good things happen in your life that you would like to continue to happen in the future. Isn't that wonderful? You tell your children in school, between today and tomorrow, could you report to me some of the good things that happened to you? Wow. Isn't that great? Yeah. Asking people to go fish for positive things between now and the next session, or between now and the next time you see your child or your spouse or somebody at work. You turn to your spouse and say, between tonight and tomorrow, tell me, just note down on your phone or a piece of paper all the positive things that happened to you at work. And then you begin to change. That is turning that switch on now from the negative towards the positive. What are you seeking? What you seek is what you get. So if you seek out positive, you'll find it. If you seek out negativity, you'll find it. If you seek out positivity, you may find a lot more of that, and you might not have expected it, but it's also actually there in front of us. We just have to seek it out. Another technique we talk about is you tell somebody to go slowly and don't expect rapid changes. So you reduce the likelihood that the client will return to a self-fulfilling prophecy of failure. Go slowly. It might not change overnight. You may see small changes take place in your life. And then you hold on to those small tiny changes that take place, and that's where real positivity grows from small little changes. I write in the book also that people should be aware of what we call frenemies. You know the expression frenemy? People who make you feel bad about yourself. People have asked me these questions. My friend pulls me down. It's so negative. Somebody was asking questions last week about this. I try to maintain this certain positivity. They throw me such negativity. Well, you have to choose then to spend less time with people that pull you down, that are your frenemies. You want to surround yourself with people that make you feel good. There's nothing like a support group of people that are there for your best interests, and you're there for their best interests. So surround yourself with positive people. Have a go-to person that you could talk positive ideas with. I have that. I have a rabbi writer. When I write my books, I turn to him, I discuss my ideas. We have a very creative time together. He's also a writer, rabbi, publisher. But I go to him, we talk about great ideas together, and we bounce off each other positivity. What about this, and what about that, and what about this? And it becomes a fun time. I don't talk to people that say, I don't think you can write your book, which people have told me, don't write that. And other people have written books, and if I spend time with those people, I'll never write a book. But if I spend time with my friend the dreamer, I'll write a lot of books. So spend time with people who you're able to share your vision, your dreams about your positive future, and you'll see that is going to be self-enhancing and self-fulfilling. But we should be what we call lamplighters. Pole de Yamama, the Gemara says, people that light up, people that bring light to others.
How do you say that?
I think it's Pole de Yamama, workers of the day, workers of light, those who bring light to others. Yeah. Pole Yamama, it says in Aramit. I think that's what it says. Let's go to another deeper level. Another therapy, which I talk about in the book, is called narrative therapy. It was a brilliant therapy, also invented about 40 years ago. It believes that there are positive gains to be made by telling a new story about yourself. This is so incredibly powerful. Each of every one of us has our own book of stories. We have a story, a narrative. Somebody could be an immigrant, worked hard and was successful. Somebody was somebody that struggled in school but ended up, being more successful because they worked hard at it. Somebody started a new business. They created their own company. Their story becomes something they've accomplished, or their story could be a very negative story. Somebody who I was never liked by my friends, right? Or somebody that was rejected by others. So people have the title of their book. You want to find out, what is your title of your book? What is your narrative? Is it a positive narrative? Is it a negative narrative? I've talked about in the past about people that overcame tremendous difficulties. I once met a child psychiatrist who defeated all odds. His parents were divorced when he was a young child. His father was a paranoid schizophrenic. He struggled very deeply with his father's illness for many years. He became a very famous, well-known child psychiatrist that was able to change his narrative. His narrative would have been neglected, horrified, traumatized child to healer of thousands of children. You can change your narrative. Now, let's say somebody didn't experience growth as well. They can look differently at what has happened to them in their lives. I talk about in the book Yosef Tzaddik, his story. Yosef in the Torah. What is his story? Beautiful child. This is one narrative. Beautiful child whose father loved him deeply, was rejected, was abandoned, thrown into a pit, and sold into slavery. Now, of course, he becomes the second to the king. But many years later, when his brothers are brought down to Mitzrayim, he's confronted by them, and he has a choice to make. What narrative could he have said to his brothers? I was your hated brother, the Jewish child who was tragically abandoned by his family and had suffered in prison all these years. But what did Yosef say? instead. He asks them to come closer to them. He says, I'm your brother Yosef, from whom you sold into Egypt. But now do not be sad. Yosef changes the entire narrative of his life. We're aware of this. He says, do not be sad. Well, why would they be sad? Because of what they did and what had happened to him. Rather, what does Yosef say? And let it not trouble you that you sold me here, for it was to preserve life that God sent me before you. It's incredible. This is Bereshit 45. And so Yosef was able to recognize that everything in his life had a purpose, that he indeed was sold into slavery in order to save the world and to save his brother's lives many years later. He saw himself purely living through Hashgacha Pratis. He was fulfilling a role in this world. Despite his suffering, he looked at his situation very, very differently. And this is so incredibly important for anyone who is struggling with depression or anxiety or struggles with pain, to be able to change their narrative. And one of the techniques in narrative therapy is called to externalize something. So how do you externalize something? The idea is to encourage a person to see the problem as confronting them, that they don't have a problem, but there's a problem confronting them. That simple change in language is extremely powerful psychologically. Someone tells you that they're terribly depressed, and you change that to say, I hear that you're struggling against your depression. Or I hear you're struggling against depression. That'd be even better. So depression is externalized to I am depressed, to you're struggling against depression. You help externalize it and take it outside of the person. Instead of somebody just saying I'm depressed and asking, tell me about the depression you're experiencing, a narrative therapist would ask, how does depression affect you? It's externalized. What does depression tell you? What is it communicating with you? The main point is to show that the client is not the problem, or the problem is not the client. Rather, the problem is trying to control the client. Instead of saying he has the problem, we tell the client that the problem has him. And then the question becomes, who's in charge of this external problem? The person or the problem? And so we're talking about externalizing things. We're talking about changing the narrative, to looking at oneself fused with emotional illness, depression, anxiety, versus something external which they're fighting against. It's much easier to fight something that you're against rather than something which is you. So this is incredibly powerful in the role of narrative therapist. So we have this idea again of externalizing things, moving it one step outside of ourselves. And we have this idea of envisioning ourselves as something different, whether the problem is ours or the problem exists, is a very big change when we view ourselves and our lives. So I'm asking people to change their narratives. Think about, what is your own personal narrative? Perhaps you'd like to do this exercise. Write down in one sentence your own narrative of your life. And once you write that down, I'd like you to challenge the narrative. How could I write a new narrative? A person who's struggled with depression most of my life, to a person who has worked towards finding solutions for depression and helps others overcome depression, is a very different narrative. A person who was rejected by friends and bullied in their school, to a person that seeks out and builds positive friendships with others. Or a person who cares about people less fortunate than themselves. What a difference in narrative. You know, people walk around deeply with that narrative. For some people, the narrative is so profound, they're in such deep states of depression that they can't do anything else besides feel those feelings. We challenge them, we want to bring the problems outside of themselves, to change their description of themselves. And by changing the very narrative, it relieves these terrible feelings we have towards ourselves. We're able to accomplish so much more with a different narrative. And if you have trouble doing this, I'd like you to turn to a very positive, loving person and help them rewrite your narrative with you. Those are the friends you really want to keep company with in your life. Who can help me talk, who can talk to me about changing my narrative? Who not only can help me change my narrative, who helps to reinforce my narrative when I'm feeling down? Those are the people you want to do. And if you want to do it for yourself, to help others, how about helping others do it for themselves as well? How about become the narrative changer in people's lives, for your children, for your spouses, people that you know in your lives, your in-laws? Become the narrative changer. Everybody around you is suffering from their narrative, so be the one that challenges everybody's narrative, looks at you differently. That's remarkable. I've worked with kids that, for example, well, in that family with a schizophrenic father, this doctor had tremendous grandparents that believed in him very much. So he had what?
Has to be somebody.
He had a parallel narrative to the negative narrative, the paranoid schizophrenia, extremely loving, embracing grandparents. So they believed in him very deeply. So they gave him the possibility to change his narrative. I've seen cases where, I'm going to really change this one, somebody whose parent was a drug dealer, and the mother was bipolar, and the family was divorced, and he was sent to a Christian school and abused in that school for many years. And he came to me very, very depressed, suffering terribly and worried about his family and so on. And I found out that he decided in 11th grade he wanted to become a nurse because he wanted to heal people that were in pain. So I spent a year or two with him helping him become a healer of other people, seeing himself as a healer, and learning how to be more successful in school, to go further with his studies and so on. So we changed, he was able to change his narrative from this, child of drug dealer and neglected and abused to a healer of other people. What badge did he walk around with in his life? And he's really doing much better than he was doing in the past. So a good therapist can help you change your narrative, and a good friend can reinforce that narrative. And you as good friends can reinforce other people's narratives as well. Okay, so with that in mind, and I talk a bit about this in the book, I give some affirmations that I'd like you to consider using in your lives. And to write down, I envision myself, and write a few lines. What do I envision myself as becoming? So here's just some possibilities, and you could just use your own. So I envision myself attracting new friends and building close relationships. Just like you did with your son. It's the exact same thing. We didn't coordinate this before the lecture. You just said it. And you can see right now, it actually worked out well. I envision myself spending quality time with people I love and enjoying our relationship. I envision myself improving my marriage and increasing my attachment with my spouse. Trying to envision that. I envision myself connecting with a parent with whom I have been distant for many years in the past. See if you can overcome that one. I envision myself marrying someone who loves and appreciates me for who I am. Talk to people on Shidduchim with that affirmation. I envision myself building a positive relationship with my child or children. If one has strained relationships with one's children, envision yourself and meditate on this every day on your list, envisioning yourself improving the relationship with your children. Isn't it amazing? And you could use this for financial gain as well. I envision myself earning more money. How about that? I envision myself being successful at work. And even more than that, write down the ways which you will be more successful at work. I'm going to get up earlier and get to work on time. I'm going to stay a bit later. I'm going to finish my projects in a timely fashion. I'm going to put more effort in to building my division of the company, or teaching the students I'm teaching, or making more sales. Imagine a salesperson who spends a few minutes a day envisioning himself making more sales. What would be better for him? Imagining himself not making sales or making sales? Where would he be best off? What would he meditate in which would give him the energy, energize him to do more? It's really visioning oneself in the positive. I told you before, I'm a university and college professor, and I prefer with my students to just do positive reinforcement as opposed to negative marking. I've seen my students, some of them flourish by just being very positive. This is what you could do better next time, type of language, as opposed to this is what you did wrong. Do this to yourself. I envision myself being more successful. I envision myself succeeding academically. I envision myself being happy in my job, despite the environment that I'm working in. How about if somebody's suffering from health issues, God forbid? I envision myself feeling better. I envision myself with less back pain. I envision myself, oh, you're a doctor. I envision myself healing from discomfort or illness. I envision myself eating well and not losing control. I envision myself exercising and improving my feelings of wellness. I envision myself climbing a mountain, biking a long distance, running a marathon, or walking a long distance. And I envision myself living longer. How about that? Bernie Siegel, who works with people who are chronic illness, when somebody comes to him with machli, says, how long do you want to live? He says, you have to want to live at least 100 years, he tells them. And that's the goal. Halavai. But you have to want to live, he says. You have to want to live. That's number one. And they're envisioning themselves living. He shows scientifically, envisioning oneself living gives you longevity. Right? So envision yourself in the medical profession, you work with patients, helping people, helping your patients, envisioning themselves being healthy. It's extremely empowering, isn't it? We know in the placebo, you want to talk a little more science, something called the placebo effect, right? We all know about this. Go to a doctor for anxiety, he gives you a sugar pill, and you still feel much better the next day. What happened? Because they say that the placebo effect may be 40 to 50%, right? There's a tremendous impact on the, well, how could there be a tremendous impact on the placebo effect? Because we know that if we envision something, it gives us more life force. There's science how it affects, you're a scientist, right? The scientist how it affects your different organs. Bernie Siegel talks about the neurobiology of this, but there's impact on different systems in your body, which allow the body to function more healthy if there's a sense of hope, as opposed to a sense of depression. So there's many things people can do in their health just by envisioning themselves eating more healthy, feeling better. If somebody's feeling sick, they should spend a few minutes a day meditating on themselves feeling better. This will be the star that they look up towards and try to access with all parts of their being. In terms of education, I envision myself passing the test. I envision myself working hard and succeeding, gaining knowledge, completing study objectives, finishing complete tractates in the Gemara or books. Tell a yeshiva student, okay, I know you're having trouble learning. Imagine in the future, in a few years from now, imagine yourself making a siyum. Imagine what it would feel like to be at that siyum with your friends around. Someone gets up and says Kaddish at the siyum, and there's some food afterwards, and feeling energized, you've completed something in your life. Meditate with people around you on very positive, worthwhile goals. You'll see that enriches their experience. They're able to just more easily move towards those goals, as we mentioned before. I mentioned many other things. Imagine yourself as a parent dealing kindly with your children, being patient and diligent, not being afraid to discipline when necessary, actively listening to them, not yelling at them when you're upset, never hitting them or hurting them inadvertently, feeling appreciated for all your hard work. Imagine your children appreciating you for all your hard work, even if they don't now. And of course, in terms of mental illness and emotional distress, if somebody's depressed, imagine themselves feeling better, happier, enjoying life, being less overwhelmed, thinking good thoughts, appreciating other people, not worrying about the future, and so on. So those are just some ways I just introduced you to the topic. Now it's up to you to actually carry this out by becoming the architect of your future, by writing your new narrative of yourself and how you envision yourself every day through a certain list of meditations. And I say every morning, get up with your list and read it to yourself for a few minutes to start your day. I think it would be incredibly powerful. When I was young, I wanted to change the world. Chafetz Chaim said this? I think Israel Salant, the story. Chafetz Chaim? And
he said he wanted to change his whole world.
then he went back and says, well, maybe I'll start with my country. He said, I may start with my city. I don't know if he was successful. I'll change my family. And it was hard. So he's left with himself, and he spent many years changing himself, and he changed the whole world. So you're right, I agree with you. It's a good point that real change comes from within yourself, and then and I'll give you a perfect example in marriage and family therapy. Just one change in the environment can change everything. If you have one person in the family, when I do marriage and family therapy, I could have several siblings and parents in the room together. And if one person in that family will do active listening, they can influence the entire family. One person. If you coach one mother to listen to their children, to do active listening. Active listening is when a person says something and you reflect back to them and you paraphrase what they're saying. I hear you. If one person in the family does this, I often see many people starting to do it in the family. Because it's strange they're doing it. They're not used to doing it. If they're coming to me, they're probably fighting or angry. If one person is able to do active listening and change the dynamics of communication in that family, people start following it. They'll go, oh, first of all, that's kind of weird. You're talking differently. And then, you know what happens? They'll start actually enjoying it because you like to talk to somebody who actively listens to you. Somebody who actively listens to you is reflecting on what you're saying. Seems interested in what you have to say. So even the most person who's against it will actually eventually be for it because they enjoy listening to somebody actively listening to them. And then they start doing to other people. So you put one little change in a system, an ecosystem, can change the entire pond, the entire environment. So exactly what you're saying is you like to change, and change by envisioning yourself behaving differently. Envisioning them succeeding even without telling them would be helpful. This is something that comes deeply from within the person. It's not forced upon other people. Yeah. The last thing I want to mention in the book is the other thing which I believe helps a person feel better is doing more chesed, doing more kindness. And I kind of believe it's the last step of the process, is helping other people. Just as a funny example, Jerry Lewis just died, a very famous comedian. Just died, 91. You didn't know he's still alive, yeah. I forgot he's a Jewish boy from Brooklyn. I forgot he has a name. And everybody's mourning Jerry Lewis. And I remember hearing about Jerry Lewis when I was a kid. My grandparents, like Jerry Lewis. Jerry Lewis was one of the most successful comedians in history, literally in history, in the 50s and 60s. He was making I read he made a $10 million contract in the 1950s. Wow. He was signed on by MGM or NBC for $10 million in 1950s. That would be being signed on for $400 million today for a contract. Wow. Anyway, so what did he end up doing? The last or the second half of his entire life. Do you know what he did? The MDA telethon, the Labor Day telethon. I don't know if you're familiar with this. For 35 years, Jerry Lewis ran a 24-hour telethon on television every year on Labor Day to raise for muscular dystrophy. That became his life purpose. And I just read that he never shared with anybody why he did it. No one knew. Did he have somebody with muscular dystrophy in his family? He called them Jerry's kids. He raised literally over $1 billion for muscular dystrophy, one Jewish man. And so I realized also that he needed to perhaps balance out his tremendous success and wealth, which can be empty with a lot of meaning, if you filled it with meaning. He did this by giving to other people. Those who give, there's some studies. There's a book called The Paradox of Generosity, and these scientists study the habits of 40 families to see if there's a correlation between doing good and feeling good. They found out, and I quote, Americans who are very giving in relationships, being emotionally available and hospitable, are much more likely to be in excellent health, 40% than those who are not, to 31%. And let me quote that again. Americans who donate more than 10% of their income, out of that group, 41% say they rarely or never experience depression versus 32% for everyone else. Scientifically. Be less depressed, give to other people. The The authors also observe that doing good creates neurochemical changes, quote, giving people more pleasure chemistry in their brain and a sense of reward for having done something good. So those who give 10% experience less depression. Those who are in giving in their relationships experience more physical health or an excellent health, and they have more positive reward, pleasure chemistry in their brains. That's a remarkable thing. So giving to others, if it's running a gemach, doing chesed, talking to somebody that needs you to talk to them, even though you may be busy and you give them time, giving tzedakah more frequently, supporting those who are doing good with your own help or volunteering in a chesed or a gemach. These are the people that experience more happiness in life, despite their environment, despite the feelings they may have, despite the challenges in their lives. They build a new future for themselves. And so giving is an incredible thing. And if you think about it, what we talked about before about self-reflection, or what we call hyper-reflection, people who are depressed and anxious are reflecting on their own sadness, their own feelings, their own obsessions. Giving is the exact opposite now. When you become a giver, right, you experience what we call abundance, which you know is my favorite word, and you become a source of light for others despite your feelings, and that light overwhelms your entire being and it overwhelms the world around you. It's transformative. So here are some basic acts of chesed you may consider: giving more tzedakah, raising money to send a child to sleepaway camp, volunteering with a child who has special needs, setting up singles up to get married, finding a job for someone out of work, driving people to medical appointments to the hospital is a chesed done. It's a tremendously important thing. Raising the money for people to get married, creating a gemach for food, clothing, toys, furniture, food, and distributing these items to needy families, visiting someone who's sick in the hospital, visiting the elderly, becoming a big brother or sister, an ach gadol or ach gadol, big brother, helping out a food pantry, inviting guests for a meal, tipping someone generously, lending your expertise, complimenting someone, holding the door for someone, listening empathetically to another person's problems. So I suggest you each, if you want to become happier and healthier individuals, ask yourself a question: what chesed can I do today? What will I do today to help somebody else? And watch to see how that influences your own emotional well-being and the emotional well-being of people around you.